Hello everyone, welcome to a series on environment and a story. Today is about the Forest Advisory Committee. But before we dive deeper, let me just mention uh, one thing about this vPlan platform. So basically this vPlan platform, it uses the data, in the sense it uses the satellite imagery or the models or the biodiversity data for the purpose of decision. So when we say a decision support tool, in simple terms you understand it something like this. Consider for instance if it uses the satellite imagery data. So that satellite imagery data can be utilized, or the remote sensing data. When you say remote sensing, sensors are attached to an aircraft or drones, and with that the images are captured. Or remote sensing data can be utilized actually. So this data can be utilized in order to, those lands which are degraded, more can be understood through these images, right? So that means where restoration is required, more priority areas for restoration can be identified. Along with that, when we are planning for restoration, usually what happens is, so those plants which are suited to a particular soil need to be planted, so as a part of the restoration plan. So with this, for this we need to get the soil data. So again this data is also taken and it is analyzed, the data of the soil is analyzed, the image data is analyzed, and also basically it analyzes along with that, like the plant density that is required in a particular area, okay, in a particular ecosystem for the restoration. So it basically, this V plan basically focuses on climate change. In simple terms, you understand, it estimates the costs, it estimates the benefits of implementing a restoration plan. Okay, you understand. So in order to estimate the cost, in order to estimate the benefits, we need to first understand which lands are more degraded, where the focus has to be more. Okay, so basically carbon sequestration, if it is focused upon, the carbon sequestration can be more, if can be enhanced if we are trying to restore an area which was is degraded currently, but this might contribute more to carbon sequestration. That particular area can be identified basically upon this data. Okay, so with regards to Forest Advisory Committee, why it was in news? So it exempted service which involves drilling or felling of trees up to 100 trees for developmental or hydroelectric projects. That means basically those projects which cuts trees up to 100 trees or less than 100 trees. So they do not need any approval actually for the purpose of development of that particular project. So basically this is a statutory body. When you say statutory body, it's formed under a particular statute, which means a law. So this is statutory body constituted under Forest Conservation Act, FCA 1980. Okay, so when you say Forest Conservation Act, what are the major reasons for enacting this is, and one more thing is, it basically approves, you can write it as approves diversion of forest land for non-forest purposes. Okay, when you say approves diversion of forest land for non-forest purposes, this non-forest purposes can be for the purpose of you can say tea, coffee, spices, then rubber, Okay, palm oil bearing plants, oil bearing plants you can call it as, etc. So, however, if it requires construction of any fencing walls for the purpose of conservation of, I mean, if for the conservation of biodiversity or wildlife, if they're trying to develop any projects, any walls for the conservation of biodiversity or for the conservation of wildlife, they may use certain fire infrastructure also in order to mitigate human animal conflicts. Okay, so or they may lead to certain conversion, I mean, you see there will be certain lines for the I mean, when habitat fragmentation happens, certain tunnels are also built for the purpose of safe passage of these animals. Okay, so all that infrastructure for which the conservation of biodiversity and wildlife is focused upon, that is usually do not consider as non-forest purposes. Okay, so the role of this forest advisory committee is recommendatory in nature. It basically advises the central government with regards to the approval of division of forest land for non-forest purposes, but it is always just recommendatory in nature. So, with regards to the Forest Conservation Act, when you say Forest Conservation Act, it was basically enacted to check or control deforestation, one of the major objective. Okay, and also to transport or transit, you can mention to control transit or transport of forest produce, and also it control levying of duties on timber and forest produce. So all of this levying of duties on timber and forest produce, and this control of transit or transport of forest produce, all of this comes under this Forest Conservation Act itself. Okay, so basically one of the major reasons for the enactment of this act, you can mention major reasons for the enactment of this act, you can mention as the, like, basically the diversion of forest land during the 25-year period, that is 1921 to 25. During this period, what happened, 1951 to 52. During this period, this 25 period, what happened is 4.135 million hectares of land has been diverted into non-forest, has been diverted for non-forest purposes without taking into consideration the environmental degradation. Without taking into consideration the environmental degradation, this much of land has been converted, which is a forest land, has been converted it into forest, non-forest purposes. So all of this is because the state governments fail to withstand local pressure. So undoubtedly you can say that this Forest Conservation Act was majorly enacted to control deforestation. Okay. in order to regulate the transit or transport of this forest produce and how much duties have to be imposed on timber and forest produce. All of this is under this particular act, that is Forest Conservation Act itself. And one thing is, this Forest Conservation Act basically talks about 4 types of forests. Okay? Reserved forests, protected forests, then village forests, I'll explain, don't worry, then private forests. Okay. With regards to the degree of protection, the reserved forests greater than, protected forests greater than village forests. So this Forest Conservation Act basically, when I'll first discuss about this reserved forest only. So within reserved forests, basically it can be any forest land or wasteland which the state government declares. You can say it constitutes actually any forest land or wasteland, and it may sell the products from these forests. It may sell the products from these forests. And with regards to the protected forests, it is also the same as any forest land or wasteland which the state government constitutes, but it is not declared a reserved forest by the state government. Usually in a reserved forest, what happens is all activities are prohibited actually, unless permitted. In the sense, what happens is, in order, like almost every activity is prohibited, okay? So in order for any activity to occur, you require permission for that. That means all activities are prohibited. In order to explicitly do any activity, you require permission. But in case of protected forest, what happens is all activities are permitted. And if any activity which is prohibited, that is mentioned. So all activities are permitted unless prohibited. Okay. And within village forest, what happens is a village community is given the rights of a state government over a particular forest land. A village community, you can write it as a village community is given rights over a forest land or over a forest land, which regulates the management of the forest. So this has rights as similar to that of a state government. Thank you. That's it for today. I'll discuss the rest in the next class. Okay. Thank you. Stay tuned for more updates.